We've also got Thom Woodroofe with us. He's an Associate Fellow with the Asia Society. He was actually in Hawaii recently with the President for APEC. Thom Woodroofe, you've said that Barack Obama's problem on foreign policy is an absence of predictability. Did you see anything in that statement which gives you some heart that there may be more predictability in the way he's heading?
To some extent, Joe. I mean, President Obama's for a long time now spoken of himself being the first Pacific president, and he did that way back in November 2009, in fact. But I think his Australian visit, and particularly the announcement of further military forces here, is really the first step in actually sealing that deal, if you will. Up until now, it's largely just been rhetoric. This is, in fact, only his third or fourth visit to Asia, compared to about 12 to Europe, for example. So, to some extent, I think that his statement that we're in the Asia Pacific and we're here to stay is a vindication of that statement, finally.
I know that one of the US journalists at the media conference yesterday said to Barack Obama that there seemed to be a bit of a schizophrenic approach by the US to China, and that had been borne out at APEC and over this last week. Do you think that was a fair enough characterisation of the US approach?
To some extent. I think it's important, firstly, to sort of point out that the US is not seeking a containment strategy here with China. And it was interesting, I thought, in his speech, he probably tried to play a bit against the comments from Indonesia and China overnight by saying that the United States' presence in Darwin, a permanent presence in Darwin, is not just in Australia's interest, but it's indeed in the region's interest, which was not something that to some extent has been communicated before this. He also, I think, played to a bit of a domestic audience over China. He was talking about trade and the American domestic economy, and obviously China is going to be an increasingly powerful part of their economic growth, and indeed the trade and export outcomes that he's seeking that Linda was talking about earlier.
Were you surprised at how much of a global outlook he took on this address? It seems like to have been a fairly significant address in terms of telling us where Barack Obama intends to go in terms of foreign policy over the term of his presidency.
To some extent, yes. I think it will probably, for the moment at least, within the region, it's probably the second biggest speech he's given, following on from his November 2009 speech in Japan, where he called himself the Pacific president. I think, though, at that period, he very much got swept up in European-focused issues, if you will. So, obviously, there was the global financial crisis, which he inherited. Then there was obviously the Eurozone crisis, which is still playing out. And I think to some extent now he can say, well, look, as we draw down from Afghanistan and Iraq in terms of our strategic aspects, and we can focus that in the Pacific, then we really do want to be here to stay. So I think it was certainly an important speech. It was very globally minded, and it was interesting Julie Gillard was talking about climate change in her introduction. And as I say, I think it'll be probably one of the two most important speeches he's certainly given in the region.
Yeah, his mention of his characterisation of the situation is that the tide of war is turning. Do you think that's fair enough?
I think it is. I think Hillary Clinton probably put it better when she called it a pivot point in a speech last Wednesday or Thursday, I think it was, alongside APEC. And her point really was, look, as we withdraw troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, we will increase our presence in the Asia Pacific for a whole range of reasons. It's probably important to point out also, in fact, that, I mean, these are US Marines that will be based in Darwin, and I think a third or two-thirds of US Marines are already based in the Asia Pacific anyway.
Yeah.
So it was certainly an interesting term for him to be a little bit more confrontational, perhaps, in his wording choice.
What about his remark that one of the beliefs of the US is that commerce and navigation in particular should not be impeded in terms of what's happening with China and the South China Sea right now?
Yeah, I expect this will actually play out a lot more over the East Asian Summit. Obama is a very outcomes-driven man when it comes to meetings and when it comes to summits. In APEC, he wanted an outcome on the TPP. This has been going on for years now. At the East Asian Summit this weekend in Bali, it's much harder for him. He's not hosting the summit. It's an ASEAN gathering. ASEAN is a slow-boiling kettle. And I think the biggest outcome that will come from the US's participation, for the first time, in fact, at the EAS, is that he'll probably shoot a shot across the bow of China regarding that South China Sea dispute, which they've remained pretty much neutral on so far. So I think
that could be a pretty prickly meeting, that East Asia Summit.
It could, but as I say, I think they've remained pretty neutral so far. China, perhaps through their spokesman overnight, by talking about the American military presence in Darwin, is perhaps anticipating something on that and trying to perhaps fend off too much of a shot across the bow by Obama over the weekend. But I think you'll expect to see it, certainly. And his justification will probably be along the lines of, look, territorial disputes are often...
OK, Tom, I've just got to interrupt you there for 1 second. We're just going to pause there and say goodbye to our Australia Network viewers who are returning to scheduled programming. Now, sorry about the interruption, Tom. We just had to say goodbye to some of our viewers. But, the situation with the East Asia Summit, and also Marty Natalegawa's statements, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, he seemed to be a little circumspect in what he was saying about this development between Australia and the US in terms of the increased or expanded US military involvement here, possibly leading to mistrust. What did you think about Marty Natalegawa's statements this morning on that?
I thought it was very surprising, Joe. Marty Natalegawa was briefed actually by Kevin Rudd on Thursday at APEC, and the US also briefed, as I understand it, China, New Zealand and India about this presence in Darwin. But the President of Indonesia, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, was actually asked at the APEC CEO Summit on Saturday what he thought of the American military presence, and he said, look, well, we expect to be told what's going to happen, so he probably personally hadn't been briefed by that stage, but he said he didn't have a problem with it. So certainly it's quite a U-turn, if you will, on those comments by the Indonesian Foreign Minister. And I think to some extent it's vindicated somewhat by the fact that when this presence was first hypothesised sort of early last week, much of the focus was on what will China think of this and the sort of Hugh White doctrines of Australia having to choose between the two countries. But not much focus was actually put on what Indonesia thought of it. So perhaps Indonesia was trying to heighten their sort of presence of mind in the US going forward particularly.
OK, Thom Woodroofe in Melbourne, thanks very much for that. We might leave that with you there.